The Rural West Conference is actually a relatively new idea at Stanford. This is the fourth one, I think, David, is that right? The fourth one? The first one was held in Utah, thanks to the Eccles family that you'll meet in a minute. It was such a success, it generated a book which has just come out called Bridging the Divide. Distance. Thinking of the election, I guess. The distance, not the divide. We have both we have to bridge, but anyway. And it was very successful, and so we did a sort of smaller version of it, thanks to one of our postdocs, Todd, at Stanford. We didn't want this tradition to die, and then we decided last year we would take it to Oregon. And some of the people here were at the one that we did at Oregon, and that was very successful. And I think eye-opening for us, getting Stanford out of the bubble of the Silicon Valley and getting to see the many different Wests that exist, and particularly to focus on the rural areas, which so often do not get the press coverage, unless it's a dispute about fracking or something. You don't read a lot about the day-to-day life in the rural West and the problems it confronts, or the cultural achievements and the rest. It tends to be more the urban West. So we hope to continue to move it around to different parts of the West. We've been now sort of on the Pacific coast, and now into the mountainous areas, and perhaps next into the Southwest. Whether in the end we'll get a kind of coherent intellectual agenda out of this, I'm not quite sure. I mean, I'm seeing emerging problems every year that seem similar, but I'm going to be very curious to listen this year, because we're covering some topics we didn't cover as much in the past, such as perceptions about the Native Americans and their community, such as the whole issue of land management, which has become so controversial in the papers. So. But hopefully, even if we can't get kind of our hands around everything and find solutions, I think we're creating a network among Western higher education institutions, universities that are doing serious scholarship and getting a chance to exchange that scholarship, and doing it in an interdisciplinary fashion. I know not just at Stanford, but in a lot of different universities, we're beginning to realize that we've hampered ourselves for many years by having kind of a stovepipe approach to academia. And I mean by that people who do history publish in history journals and talk to other historians. People who do political science do the same thing. People in law do the same thing. And I think over the last 10 years, we're realizing that you need to break those barriers down. We need to have interdisciplinary approaches when we think about policy problems, or we think about the way societies are evolving. That's not easy to do, because there are a lot of pressures in academia to stay within your narrow lane and not deviate, as many of the academics in here know. But there are real intellectual rewards for doing that. So we're really pleased that we can combine the rural West and the need to have a focus on the rural West, and the joy of just coming out and experiencing the rural West with the interdisciplinary framework that we've created with this. I want to thank my partner, Chris Musty. He was a former graduate student of mine at Berkeley, and he's actually easier to work with now than he was when he was a graduate student. He used to resist me more as a graduate student. Now he knows that I'm right. That's not true. I just thought I'd annoy him a little. But anyway, he really has put a lot of time and effort into this, helping us identify the excellent people that he's been able to find on the Montana campus, pointing us in the right direction in terms of who to talk to set up the logistics. I will talk a little bit more about giving thanks to all the various people that are on our staff and the Montana staff that have helped us. But I think we want to get started with the program. The suggestion that Chris had is that when David gives his talk, David, if you see that the clears in the back, you're to hesitate for a minute so people can turn around and look and finally get the view that we got this room for. I think it's starting to clear a little bit. So. We would not be able to do this if it weren't for the support of the Eccles family. They are, big supporters of Stanford, but also of the Lane Center. and longtime friends of the Bill Lane Center and serve on our board. So we're really pleased, not only that they have supported us, but that they braved the elements to come here. We got diverted to Bozeman. They thought they might get diverted, but they managed to land. What we're going to do is I want to introduce Hope Eccles, who's on our board, a graduate of Stanford, and she is going to introduce our speaker, Professor David Kennedy. So, Hope.
Good evening, and the view is lovely. Thanks so much for this opportunity to introduce an eminent historian and a very dear friend. Oh,
Just put the mic.
How's that?
That's better.
I hope it's worth listening to. David asked me to share a few thoughts on my family's involvement with the Bill Lane Center for the American West, and particularly the Rural West Initiative. I got to know David about 8 years ago when he approached me to get involved with the Lane Center, and as a lifelong Westerner, the Lane Center instantly intrigued me. My family's heritage and legacy, both the Eccles and my mother's Peterson family, are deeply rooted in the West. David Eccles and his family immigrated from Scotland in 1863 with barely more than the clothes on their backs, while the Petersons left relative comfort in Sweden to settle the dry, barren valleys of central Utah. Both families helped settle communities throughout the West, making this region a home for themselves and their posterity. The Lane Center realizes that wide-ranging challenges continue to face Western North America and will require strong programs and research to address, in a balanced and unbiased way, the myriad of issues affecting the future of the West and its citizens, from water, energy, natural resources, to law, governmental policy, and health care, as well as fostering an understanding and appreciation of Western history, geography, literature, art, and culture. The interdisciplinary approach that David has fostered at the Lane Center advances the scholarly and public understanding of the past, present, and future of Western North America. The Rural West Initiative is a great example of the strength of this approach. David first introduced me to Teddy Roosevelt's report of the Country Life Commission and talked about his idea for the Rural West Initiative a few years ago. With deep ties still to the rural areas of the Intermountain West, I was pleased to find someone of David's stature willing to create an environment where rigorous scholarly research combined with the experiences of the people on the ground to study problems that often seem insurmountable or of little interest to urban and suburban people. In reading the Commission's report, I was struck that while much has changed, so many of the challenges of the rural areas remain the same. David Kennedy is a faculty director emeritus of the Bill Lane Center for the American West. Together with historian Richard White, he co-founded the center in 2005 and served as its first director. Professor Kennedy is the Donald J. McLaughlin Professor of History Emeritus at Stanford University. He received the 1999 Pulitzer Prize for his book, Freedom from Fear, The American People in Depression and War, 1929 to 1945. It's a terrific book. His scholarship reflects his interdisciplinary training in American studies, which combines history, literature, and economics. However, David is not only a consummate scholar, he is also an avid outdoorsman and pilot. He has fly fished throughout the West and in far-flung areas of the world, floated rivers, and hiked mountains in places I can't even pronounce. He's flown his Cessna through regions as diverse as the San Juan Islands on the Salcius Sea and the redwood forests of Northern California. Last summer, Professor Kennedy was selected by Secretary of Agriculture Tom Vilsack to serve on the Pacific Northwest Scenic Trail Advisory Board. This trail, designated by an act of Congress, will stretch 1,200 miles from Glacier National Park in Montana to Cape Alava, I practiced, on Washington's Pacific coast. Needless to say, David has already backpacked and horsepacked most of the trail. Scholar, teacher, dynamic organizer, and passionate Westerner. It is our great pleasure to hear now from David Kennedy.
Thank you very much, Hope. The point hardly needs belaboring, but I'm going to belabor it anyway, that the title of this gathering, the 4th Annual Eccles Rural West Conference, owes a great deal to the Eccles family. Not only this gathering here in Missoula, but also the previous 3 conferences in Ogden, Troutdale, and Stanford, as well as this one. And indeed, the Eccles family have very generously contributed to our fundamental ongoing programming at the Lane Center, and I think it's fair to say we couldn't do it without you, so thank you very much. Bruce mentioned the first of these gatherings in Ogden, Utah in 2012 did result in a book, a collection of essays from that conference. The book is edited by David Danbaum, published by University of Utah Press. The title is Bridging the Distance. And I commend it to you, all of you in this room who have an interest in the whole suite of issues that affect this great region of ours, especially its rural dimensions. The book will have a lot to instruct you about. The book's only been out a few months, I believe. I got my first copy just 2 or 3 months ago. So if you haven't acquired it yet, I commend it to you very, very strongly. Hope mentioned, and quite rightly, that we first started thinking about something like the Rural West Initiative at the Lane Center several years ago as we approached the centenary of the publication of the document she mentioned, called simply the Report of the Country Life Commission, a commission that was put together by Theodore Roosevelt in his last year in office, published the year he left office in 1909. A study headed by a very colorful and colorfully named social scientist at Cornell University by the name of Liberty Hyde Bailey. And Liberty Hyde Bailey's group, or Theodore Roosevelt, I should say, was motivated to undertake a formal scholarly study of what he called country life. I suppose we could say rural life would be a very good synonym. Because obviously, if you just let your mind spool back a bit to that era, he was concerned about the fallout and ongoing consequences of the populist upheavals, which were mostly agrarian and rural-based in the 1890s in particular. So this was an effort to try to gather scientifically reliable data about what were the terms of life in the American countryside, with an eye toward eventually developing policies that would be cogent and appropriate for the issues that were identified there. And indeed, as Hope said, if you read that document, and it's another document I commend to all of you, it's a very interesting study even now 100 plus years on, you'll find a number, the Liberty Hyde Bailey's Commission called out a number of issues that they called deficiencies that attended life in the American countryside in that era a century ago. The first and foremost one that they talked about, and mind you, this is 100 years ago, was population loss. And with population loss, the loss of all kinds of related things like cultural vitality, economic dynamism, and not least of all, political power. And I'll come back to political power in just a minute. But they listed other things as well, underemployment, if not downright unemployment, chronic economic insecurity, seasonal employment in the agricultural sector, inadequate health care, under-resourced schools, meager credit facilities, very poor access to credit. One of the populist great demands was to nationalize the banks and make more credit available in the countryside. And not least of all, they chronicled what to us might seem astonishing, and it was astonishing even then, the lack of just ordinary amenities that were by that time already common in urban households, like indoor plumbing, electricity, and telephones. 80% of rural homes in this country lacked indoor plumbing as late as 1930. So this was the American countryside was a place where the terms of living, the standard of living, was markedly and measurably lower than it was in other places. Now, many of these issues that were identified in 1909 in the report of the Country Life Commission, population loss, loss of political power, loss of cultural vitality, economic dynamism, economic insecurity, poor access to health care, poor access to credit, and we might add a modern version of this, poor access to broadband. All of these persist. to some degree or another, maybe not as chronically or as urgently as they did a century ago. But nonetheless, these are issues that still are alive in rural America, not least of all in the rural West. So I'm going to get to the Pacific Northwest National Scenic Trail in just a minute, and we're fortunate we have the two principal Forest Service managers of that pretty ambitious project here with us. So I may eventually turn the platform over to them to elaborate. But just a quick overview. Overall, the United States overall, there are more than 2,000 counties that are classified as rural. 3/4 of the land area of the United States as a whole is classified as rural, and about 50 million people live in rural districts, about 1/6, a little less than 1/6 of the total American population. Now, even having gone this far into the conversation, you might be thinking, well, how do you define rural? An excellent question, because the United States, virtually every single United States government agency has a different definition of rural. The Census Bureau has a definition, the Department of Agriculture has a definition, the Department of Health and Human Services alone has 7 different definitions of rural. So there's plenty of controversy about what exactly we mean when we're talking about rural, but it's widely agreed, leaving the fine points of those definitional distinctions aside, that though there are rural counties all over the United States, what's peculiar about ruralness or rurality in the American West is the factor of distance. Come back to the title of our book, Bridging the Distance. It's what the Census Bureau classifies rural counties into high density, medium density, and low density. Almost all the low density rural counties are in the American West. West are on the sunset side of the 100th meridian. So to be in a rural county anywhere in the country is to be isolated with inferior access to a lot of amenities that we take for granted. But to be in a rural western county means to be even more isolated and lonely with even poorer access. So the West is the locus of, you might say, an extreme version of ruralness. It's not unknown in other parts of the country. Appalachia is the other predominantly rural region, but the West has its own peculiar characteristics. Now, in fact, this raises an historical paradox that people have dwelt on for quite a while. Since the census of 1880, the West has been measured demographically the most urbanized region. That is, in the western states as a whole, a greater percentage of people live in urban settings than anywhere else in the country, whereas measured in terms of just geographical area, the West is the most rural part of the country. So depending on how you define rural, we're at one and the same time. The West is the most urban and the most rural of the 4 major sections of the United States. Can I have the next slide, please, Jeff? So there's another feature of rural life in the western United States that distinguishes it from life elsewhere in the country. If you look at this map up there on the wall, the little red maps inside each state line boundaries indicate the percentage of the surface of any given state that is owned and managed to this day by the federal government. So there are many ways we can define the West. It's the place where rural life is the most lonely. It's the place where we have the combination of topographical heterogeneity and aridity that gives us the water management problems that we have. It's the area that was settled last in the historical arc of our national development. It's also the place, by definition, where the federal government has a more massive presence on the ground in everyday life, especially in rural regions, the rural parts of the West, than is true anywhere else in the country. I can share with you an anecdote from a course that Bruce Kane and I and 3 other colleagues of ours, we think it's the most interdisciplinary course at Stanford or any other university in the country. It's Introduction to the American West, and we have instructors from the Department of History, that's me, political science, that's Bruce, art history, literature, and environmental, it's not distance, what's the word I'm looking for? Environmental and civil and environmental engineering, that's it, okay. So anyway, I gave a lecture in that course last fall about the federal presence in the West. And a student came up to me at the end of the class. He's from Sonora County in the Sierra foothills, a rural county. And I've been talking about how people in the rural West deal with the federal government on a day-to-day basis in a way that people in the urban West just do not. And he said, I hadn't really thought about this stuff before. He says, this is the first time that I really started to understand my redneck neighbors. So we think we're doing some good about educating our hyper-privileged Stanford students about some of the rural areas that they will have to deal with, we hope. So here's so the federal presence in the West is massive, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute, not least of all when we talk about the Pacific Northwest National Scenic Trail, which we're going to do in just a moment. But I want to come back to some politics again. I mentioned earlier that one of the findings of the report of the Country Life Commission was the fact that there was a felt development 100 years ago that population loss translated directly into loss of political power. One of the things that agitated the populist movement, of course, it was kind of the last-ditch stand of that economic social sector as it felt its own power waning as the country became urbanized and industrialized. But I want to come back to some of the political dimensions of the rural West in our own time. And I'm drawing here on an article that appeared last August, I think, it might have been September, in a journal called Political Geography. And the title of the article was Red Rural, Blue Rural. Challenge a Frenchman to say that. The authors were Dante Scala and Kenneth Johnson, both the University of New Hampshire. And they came up with what I think are some really interesting findings that are relevant to our discussion here in Missoula over the next day or so. They found that in 2012, George Romney won 78% of those 2,000 or so rural counties and 63% of all rural votes. And they came up with a little bit of a typology. They called the Romney counties, guess what, the red counties, and the Obama counties, Obama got 37% of rural voters, the blue counties. And then they made a further distinction, actually several distinctions, about how to characterize these rural counties by their core economic occupations, identities, and so on. And at either end of the spectrum, that is the most deeply red and the most deeply blue, the two anchor categories, were what they called agricultural counties, what the Country Life Commission report would have called farming communities. Out west, I suppose we'd say they're at least as much ranching communities. And at the other end is what they called recreational counties. It turns out that in what they call the recreational counties, Obama won more than 50% of the vote in those counties. There are 239 of those counties in their study. So it's a minority number of counties, but it was the blue part of the spectrum as far as their analysis went. And then they go on to speculate that in the next 20 years or so, some 70 million baby boomers are going to retire, and a certain fraction of them, maybe an awful lot of them, are probably going to move to places where housing is less expensive and they have access to recreational amenities of the sort that characterize these so-called recreational counties. So they venture a prediction that it won't be too long in the future before the political complexion of the West begins to change, especially as people begin to concentrate in these so-called recreational counties, and maybe even more so-called recreational counties come into being. So that leads me, maybe an awkward transition, to the recreational facility that's already been mentioned, the Pacific Northwest National Scenic Trail. So Jeff, can we have the first trail there? Okay. So this trail, and as I say, we have the two principal managers of it here, so what I don't know or get wrong, they can certainly fill in. But the trail has its legislative origins in an act of Congress in 1968 called the National Trail System Act, which provided for both scenic trails and historical trails, and I think some others. I think the category is recreational trails, if I'm not mistaken. There's lots of them, but the two big categories are scenic and historic. This map, a little confusing to look at, shows both scenic and historical trails. Can we get the next one, which I think just isolates the scenic trail system. The ones you've probably heard of already in existence are the Pacific Crest Trail there on the left side of this schematic map, made famous by Drew Barrymore and so on. The Appalachian Trail, made famous by Nick Nolte and Robert Redford. And the Continental Divide Trail and a few others scattered around. This map shows, although it's very difficult to see, very up there in the top left-hand corner in green, going east to west, the Pacific Northwest National Scenic Trail, which will have its eastern terminus here in the state of Montana, near, or is it in or near Glacier National Park? It's in the park. And then it traverses across western Montana, Idaho, and the entirety, actually, of the state of Washington, and comes to rest, as Hope correctly said, at Cape Alava on the Washington coast there. And you can see the red line there just underneath the Canadian border. That is the 1,200-mile route of the Pacific Northwest National Scenic Trail. Jeff, is this the point where we're going to get to the action, or do we have more? We have one more? Oh, this is just a close-up. So let me point out one thing which is easier to see in this map than any other you're going to see. And frankly, one of the things that makes this whole project so interesting to me as an academic observer and participant is the number of jurisdictions through which this trail passes. 3 states, Montana, Idaho, and Washington. 3 national parks, Glacier, North Cascades, and Olympic. And if I got it right, 6 national forests? 7 national forests. Also pockets of state land and private land, and it at least touches on one Indian reservation there, the Colville Reservation in eastern Washington. So at the one, full disclosure, I'm on the advisory council for this body. You put it a little grandly, Hope, when you said I was there at the invitation of the Secretary of Agriculture. I was there because I lobbied for it, twisted people's arms to get on this thing. So you kind of overstated the case. But we've only had one meeting of the advisory council so far in Sandpoint, Idaho, last fall. And my biggest takeaway from that meeting was just how many jurisdictions and interests and parties and players there are that all have to be somehow, if not fully reconciled with each other, at least harmonized, if this trail is going to be a more or less continuous, uniform experience from one end to the other. So there are political, jurisdictional issues embedded in this that I find just absolutely fascinating. And I'm very happy to say that thanks to the receptiveness of the Forest Service, that the Bill Lane Center for the American West at Stanford is going to send 2 interns up to the Northwest this summer, Stanford students, one of whom will work entirely on trail issues in eastern Washington. So we're trying to engage our students as deeply and actively as possible to give them some kind of at least introductory education about the complexities of mounting an initiative like this trail. Okay, I think this is the cue that we're about to go live here. Thanks to Jeff McGee, who is the Creative Communications Director at the Bill Lane Center and knows how to do stuff that I can't imagine even doing. We're going to take a flyover from the eastern end of the trail to the western terminus at about 8,000 feet. And we're going to stop at a couple of places of particular interest along the way. So here we are essentially at the trailhead in Glacier National Park, and we're about to take off. So Jeff, wheels up. So here we go through Glacier National Park. We're going to go at varying speeds too, again, thanks to the wizardry of Jeff McGee. So I think we're kind of going at the leisurely sightseeing pace here. And then we're going to speed up at certain less visually interesting parts of the trail. We're about to transition into Idaho here. Any minute, you're going to see the Idaho border. But you can see how much of the trail goes through quite mountainous country. Kootenai National, one of the 7 national forests. And here we're about to get into Idaho. Idaho doesn't last long because we're just going across the top of the panhandle. And then we get into my home state. And it's true, Hope, I've done most of the trail in Washington State and a little bit of it in Montana, Idaho, but not the whole thing by any means. So I blinked there. Are we in Washington State yet? Yes, okay. So this is the Columbia River, or it's what's is now Lake Roosevelt. It's where the Columbia River is backed up. So this is one of the places that Jeff and I thought it might be worth stopping. This is what Lake Roosevelt looks like a little bit south, actually, of the trail course. And of course, Lake Roosevelt is one of the great water impoundment, irrigation, hydroelectric generating facilities in all the western region. It's in a category with Hoover Dam as one of the great iconic projects that come out of the mid-20th century. And of course, this is eastern Washington. Those of you familiar with the interior of Washington, Oregon states know what this looks like. It's pretty rough-looking country, and without that water captured from the Columbia River and distributed, Grand Coulee Dam. I'm very fond of Grand Coulee Dam because, for among other things, My father got his first wage-paying job in 6 years during the Great Depression. In 1937, he got a job at the grocery store at the construction site. And when I read Boys in the Boat, which I presume many people in this room might have read, the principal character in that worked on Grand Coulee Dam. I venture to think he and my father might have been acquainted with each other. But I've always been fond of Grand Coulee Dam for that reason, just personally. But of course, Grand Coulee Dam is one of these great federal infrastructural investment projects that has made the modern West what it is. So we go across eastern Washington looking uncharacteristically green in this transit. And we soon come to one of my favorite places in all the planet, which is the North Cascades National Park, which I have traversed more than once, actually. And Jeff, aren't we about to get there? Are we in high gear? Overdrive yet? The yellow line is the Canadian boundary, incidentally, so you can see how this trail hugs the Canadian boundary, with one big exception in eastern Washington. Maybe, no, we're not there yet. It was behind us, where it dips down toward the town of Republic. So now we're in the North Cascades, coming up on Mount Baker, which is on the western side of the North Cascades. That's Mount Baker there to the right. And isn't this another place, Jeff, where we have some still shots? We think that's Mount Baker in the background. I'm not 100% sure. If so, those will be the pickets right in front of us, but I'm not 100% sure we've got the... You did? No, okay. But again, I mean, just to say the obvious, this is extraordinarily scenic and beautiful country, and it's such a great idea that the Congress in 1968, back when it was having some great ideas and could do something about them, initiated this whole program of building these national trails and maintaining them, and this, I think, is going to be one of the truly great ones. So now we transition out of the Cascades. There's Baker Lake. We're going to go down the Skagit River Valley. Those of you who've ever read Toby Wolfe's book, This Boy's Life, that's where that story took place, in the Skagit Valley. And we come out into Puget Sound. That's the blue water you're seeing there. And then in just a moment, you're going to see one peculiar aspect of this trail. It has to cross the water. And even intrepid hikers can't walk on water. So that's actually part of the trail. Washington State Ferry, the good vessel Wenatchee. We haven't yet come up with a solution to this problem about how we can get across the Puget Sound without actually putting people on the boat. That you maybe went by too fast, but behind the ferry there was the Olympic Mountains in the background. So we're about to enter Olympic National Park here. For those of you who've hiked in these two parks or been in the two, the North Cascades and the Olympics, they have a different geological history. The North Cascades are much more volcanic in origin, and the Olympics owe much more of their geological character to tectonic plate movement. And if you're actually in the two parks, you can really feel and see the difference in their geological formation. The Olympics are much lower, but much more dense alpine environment than the North Cascades, which are a bit more spread out. Something that really you have to be there to see it. But this is the Olympics coming out down, I think, the Hoh River drainage, which we'll get to in a moment. Down, is it the Hoh River that exits the park? Is that the one? And then we come out on the Washington coastline, where there's already existing trail, I believe, up the Washington coast. Here we are. And we come up almost to Nia Bay at the far end of the Strait of Juan de Fuca at Alava Point. So there we are. So it's quite a production, this trail. And I must say, thanks to Jeff McGee, because putting this video together was quite a production, as far as I'm concerned. So I believe that it's possible to argue that if those authors at the University of New Hampshire in that paper I cited earlier, rural, blue rural, red rural, are onto something, that this trail will actually serve the purpose of enhancing the recreational facilities and usage of this rather considerable piece of rural Montana, Idaho, and Washington. And again, as it happened just coincidentally, I was in eastern Washington last week and near Walla Walla in the Palouse country in eastern Washington at Whitman College. And frankly, not to put too fine a point on it, I think that region can use all the economic stimulus that it can get. So this trail, I think, will make, something more than a modest contribution to the economic and social and cultural vitalization of that big strip there right below the Canadian border. So I'm going to stop here. I'm going to invite the two Forest Service managers of the trail who are here to come up and say a word, if they'd like to, about anything that I've missed that you think is of particular importance. So it's Matt McGrath and Becky Blanchard. Would you care to add anything?
I think you covered everything.
Everything.
How long would it take to do the walk?
Well, people have done the hike. They've done it as a through hike. Who's that guy that was with us at Sandpoint?
Jeff Kish.
He-
It takes 2 to 3 months to go from one end to the other.
2 to 3 months, so you can do it in a single season, where it'd be pretty difficult to do the Pacific Crest Trail in a single season. I guess it's been done. Yeah, yeah. So any volunteers want to make one of the first hikes? All right, well, I'm happy to take questions, yeah. Oh, you're volunteering, okay. Good question. When will it, in a sense, it's open now, because at least one person has done it. Okay.
That's okay. I'll try to not get too deep
Matt
into
McGrath,
my sales pitch. My name is Matt McGrath. I work for the U.S. Forest Service. I'm very fortunate to have one of the best jobs in the Forest Service and work entirely on the Pacific Northwest National Scenic Trail. I would disagree with David's characterization of him applying for the advisory council, where he makes it seem like he had to twist arms as soon as his application came in. Becky and I sat there in our cubes with looks of joy at this great connection to Stanford that we were really happy to have. And very excited about that. As David mentioned, the National Trail System Act was passed in 1968, and the Pacific Northwest National Scenic Trail was added to the National Trail System in 2009. It was actually first proposed in 1970 by a Georgetown student who took the summer off and was hiking around Glacier National Park and decided it would be a great idea to hike to the coast. And so he started doing that, and he spent the next few years trying to find the right route. So it's a 1,200-mile route from one end to the other. About 900 miles are on trail, and unfortunately about 300 miles utilize roads to make that connection. So one of the big projects that Becky and I are working on over the next few years is figuring out, okay, how do we get the trail off of these roads and improve recreational opportunities? I would just say one thing that we really like about the trail, and as David made that great walk through from one end to the other in northeastern Washington, is one of the most rural areas of the Pacific Northwest National Scenic Trail, and it's also where we have many of the small communities that we're working with, really as they're trying to pivot towards a more sustainable outdoor recreation-based economy and get away from either the coal mines closing, or they're not cutting as many trees as they used to, and are really kind of now making that move and are having some trouble in some areas with it, and it takes a little while. So we're very excited that one of the interns that is joining us this summer from Stanford is going to be out working in those rural counties in northeastern Washington to start having that conversation with the communities about what's important about their land in that area, what do they value about it, and also how does this trail contribute to the future of those communities. So we're really excited about that and appreciate having you set us up with that. So thank you very much.
That intern is training for her time in eastern Washington by spending weekends in Portola Valley. Yeah, you got to know the geography of Palo Alto to understand. That's a joke. Pat.
What's your budget, and how much of it is spent on new trail building, and how much of it is spent on maintenance of the existing?
That's actually a really good question. Right now we're working on, because we're feds, we like to plan. So we're working on a management plan, which is what the advisory council is helping us with. And so they are helping us identify areas where the trail is not in a sustainable location, where we want to look at relocating it, and then those obvious 300 miles of roads where the trail needs to be moved. So in the past couple of years, the average for the last couple of years has been about $130,000 going to mostly trail maintenance and a little bit of trail construction, getting started on over by Lake Koocanusa, which is not the giant lake that David showed, but over in Montana. I'm from Seattle, so I'm used to saying over. So here in Montana, Lake Koocanusa, where there's a 7-mile stretch of our non-motorized trail on a highway. So like the local forest there is working on building a trail along the lake shore, and so we're working with them on that. So one of the great things is, we always think about folks who through hike from one end to the other, like it was Reese Witherspoon in the Wild movie that did it. I only remember that because I just watched it a little while ago. But people always think about through hiking, but it's really the future of outdoor recreation, as you pointed out, with folks moving to these communities, is really in shorter trips. People are busier. If they're not retired, they're busier and they don't have time to take 2.5 months or 5 months on the Pacific Crest Trail. So we're really working with communities to provide shorter opportunities, day trips, weekend trips, maybe long weekend trips, and that's kind of one of the things we're thinking about working on with the Stanford intern, is identifying some of those opportunities and then working with communities to figure out how to talk about it.
David.
Throughout the length of your new trail, how frequently do you have to deal with the restrictions of wilderness constraints on chainsaws, mechanical equipment?
There are several hundred miles of the trail in wilderness areas. And so for folks who are not totally familiar, wilderness areas, generally non-mechanized, non-motorized, so a lot of cross-cut saws and not chainsaws. So generally any of the miles of our trail in wilderness, we have that prohibition. And we have not had too many fires in wilderness areas. We've had a lot of our fires off of wilderness areas and followed by the traditional blowdown of those trees in the next big storm. So like on the Kettle Crest in that area of northeastern Washington, which actually is basically inaccessible this year because there's just too many trees down up there. Fortunately, they will be able to use chainsaws, but it's still going to be a month-long process just to clear out probably 30 or 40 miles of trails. Will take a crew all summer long.
From my experience along the 500 miles of Untitled Trail, it's the worst maintained trails are in the wilderness areas. For that very reason, it's too dangerous to deal with.
They certainly can be. They're tough to access. They're great when you get there, but they can be tough to access and keep open. One of our challenges.
Well, we don't want to stand any longer.
Yes.
Thanks, Matt.
No, thank you.
We don't want to stand any longer between you and dinner, which I believe is ready. We're ready to go. So, Bruce, did you want to say some concluding remarks? Like bon appetit, or you want to say distance again? Well, thank you all very much, and I look forward to a great couple of days of discussion.